my job, besides working in New York City at a medical school, I also consult for the government in terms of recommendation of certain drugs. So I got interested in clinical trials. And when you do clinical trials, one of the issues that comes up is placebo. So I wanted to talk about that because it's not really obvious. The term placebo comes from the 14th century, I shall please. It was used at people chanting at Catholic Vespers for the dead. These were paid mourners, and they would chant placebo, placebo, placebo. And that's what it meant initially. But Hooper's Medical Dictionary in 1811 said that placebo basically was something that doctors did to please the patient rather than to benefit them. And then Henry Beecher in 1955, for the first time, showed that there was actually physiological effects of placebo. They weren't just nothing. They actually changed physiology. Now, these are standards of care, so you have to understand how you generally treat things. This is from 1921, the London Pharmacopoeia, and this was used for centuries. So these were well-accepted treatments. What are they? Eusnia, which is moss from the skull of victims of violent death. Vigo's plaster, which is viper's flesh, live frogs and worms. And Gascoigne's powder, which is bezoar, like hairballs. Amber, pearls, crab's eyes, coral, black tops of crab claws. This was a standard of medical care in 1921 through much of the world, particularly in Europe. Now, when you think of placebo in a clinical trial, we think, it's maybe some sort of pill or something like that. Well, there are many, many kinds of placebos, and they have different effects. For example, the best placebo going is surgery. You can't beat surgery. It works like a charm. Almost as good as an injection. And if the injection really hurts, that's even better. And if it's red and hurts, that's terrific. If you give a capsule, placebo, it's better than any pill. And a gold and silver capsule are better than colored capsules. Colored are still better than white capsules, and all capsules are better than pills. If you give someone 2 placebos, it's much more effective than 1 placebo. Bigger is better, but you already knew that. And if you give a placebo 4 times a day, that's much better than giving it once or twice a day. If it's bitter, it's great. The physical setting matters, and I work for a medical school, and what happens in a well-known medical school is you do better than anyone else because you have a higher placebo response. The physical center really matters. And finally, we forget as doctors that doctors are placebos. And if you do it wrong, you're the opposite, which is a nocebo, which is what I want to talk about as well. Not just placebo, which is a good thing, but nocebos. And finally, I'll talk about the ultimate nocebo, which is Voodoo Death. So now George Washington was the president, as you presumably remember, and you got to assume that he got good care. I mean, he was the president. So I'll give you the punchline. Those of you in medicine, he died of low blood pressure. That's what killed him. Because what he had was quinsy, which is a peritonsillar abscess, but he died of low blood pressure. So how was he treated by these brilliant physicians? He was treated with bleeding, and he was treated with dehydration, and he had a fever induced, and he was given cathartics to produce diarrhea, and tartar emetics to make him vomit. So this is the care that George Washington got, placebos.
If you were to follow a busy doctor as he makes his daily round of calls, you would find yourself having a mighty busy time keeping up with him. Time out for many men of medicine usually means just long enough to enjoy a cigarette. And because they know what a pleasure it is to smoke a mild, good-tasting cigarette, they're particular about the brand they choose. In a nationwide survey, more doctors smoke Camels than any other cigarette. Why not change to Camels for the next 30 days and see what a difference it makes in your smoking enjoyment? See how Camels agree with your throat. See how mild and good-tasting a cigarette can be.
So you've been giving good medical advice at the talk tonight. Okay, now you got to promise me when you go home, you won't tell your grandmother that I showed you this slide. But this is something called glucosamine and chondroitin, used for arthritis. And it works really, really well. And it works for up to half a year. The problem is it's no better than placebo. Now, placebos help pain. We know that. If you give a patient placebo and they think they're getting something effective, it works very well. And what's interesting is it activates receptors in the brain called opioid receptors, which are the same receptors when you give someone an opioid that it hits. Well, what's interesting about this is there's a drug we use in medicine called naloxone. And if you give someone naloxone, they don't feel it. If you start an IV and you give them naloxone, not like they feel anything or would even know you gave it to them. However, it reverses the effect of an opioid. So what happens is, if you give a patient something that they think is going to work, and they feel better, their pain's better, and without telling them, you give them naloxone, their pain comes back. And so that shows to us is it really is these opioid receptors, and what we've learned is the expectation of pain relief activates these receptors, and we can prove it, and we also know it's reversible with naloxone. Well, there's another thing in the brain, part of our reward system called dopamine, and dopamine is very much tied into our reward system. Many of us seek dopamine, and if you really seek dopamine, there are a few very effective ways of getting it. One is cigarette smoking, one is cocaine, one is carbohydrates. Carbohydrates are great for increasing dopamine levels. So I'll remind you, and I remember this, when the stock market crashed however many years ago, and everyone was walking around miserable, awful, they lost all their money, it was awful. One business came up in New York City, Dylan's Candy Shop, and they did great, because when we were dysphoric, when we feel terrible, we reward ourselves with carbohydrates. So what do we do in clinical trials? Well, we came up with this brilliant idea that this is supposed to be neutral. We give people sugar. Not really a good idea. So what we've learned is one of the ways we reward ourselves, and I do this whenever I come to Brooklyn, is we go to bakeries, we eat candy, and we increase our dopamine levels. Well, another thing that does it is caffeine. And caffeine is very effective in releasing dopamine in parts of the brain. Well, it turns out that placebo coffee, decaf, does the same thing. So I want you to do a little experiment, okay, when you go home this weekend. Invite some friends for dinner, and after dinner, when your friends say, oh, if you give me coffee, I'll stay up all night. Give me decaf. So you give them regular coffee, and you don't tell them, and you call them up in the morning and find out how they slept, and it won't make a difference. Now, it turns out that we've learned that optimists, fundamentally, they have a higher placebo response. The more optimistic you are, the better you do with placebos. But the problem is that pessimists do the opposite. The more pessimistic you are, the more likely you are to develop a nocebo response. So you heard about this earlier. I don't want to start a big controversy, but there's this thing called evolution, if you believe in it. Okay. But perhaps the capacity to heal yourself is an evolutionary advantage. We think that kind of makes sense. So there's a natural selection, if you believe in evolution, for people who are optimists and people who can heal themselves with placebo response. Now, turns out we've identified 11 placebo genes, and I'm sure more are coming. We have 11 mechanisms genetically why certain people are placebo responders. So get over the idea that we're just sort of faking them out. There are genetic explanations for this. Now, I'm not saying these things don't work or they're bad or anything like that, but the question is, megavitamins, what's the mechanism? Good nutrition. The reason you get heart attacks from eggs is because you think you get heart attacks from eggs. Organic foods, jogging, holistic medicine, there are a lot of things that may be great. I'm not telling you they're not great, but we actually don't have a whole lot of data behind them. Now, there's this thing called nocebo, which I want to talk about. And if you do clinical trials, what you discover is about 25% on average in a clinical trial has an adverse event from your drug, which is a placebo. So you give them a placebo, and a lot of people get very sick from the placebo. And we'll talk about Voodoo Death, but powdered Egyptian mummy is used very widely, particularly in Europe, and that has a huge amount of arsenic. And a lot of people used to use powdered Egyptian mummy as a medical treatment. Acupuncture caused endemic jaundice, hepatitis all over China. How about Voodoo Death? Now, I'm going to talk about really two kinds of Voodoo Death, which are a little bit different. But the concept is, and you have to have a few things to believe. Well, number one, someone gives you a hex that you're going to die, okay? Number two, you have to believe this. Number three, there's nothing you can do about it. If there's some way you can get out of this, you probably will not have Voodoo Death. And number four, everyone who's had this before died. So it's very common in Central and South America, Africa, Australia, and the Caribbean. And there are two kinds. There's one which is sudden death, and there's one which is sort of gradual. So the sudden death one is due to hyperactivity, and you get kind of epinephrine, adrenaline types of effects, and I'll talk about how that may happen. And the other one is due to hypoactivity. It's kind of like catatonia. Someone gives you this spell, and you kind of wither away. All these were described by Walter Cannon, even in the 1920s. In the South American Tapanamba men, when they were condemned by medicine men, many of them died of fright. The Hausa people in Niger withered away after they were told they were bewitched. And there was a story of a Nairobi woman who ate fruit. She was told you can't eat fruit from this tabooed region, but she did. And as soon as she found out about it, she died. So let's go to the hypoactive, the one where you kind of wither away. These people at the end of their rope, there's nothing they can do about it. They're helpless, and they're going to die. And they're no longer competent. Nothing is fun. There's no pleasure. The members of the family pull down the shades. They begin to make funeral preparations, and then they die. This is an interesting case by Mathis, 1964. There was a man who had asthma. His mother told him not to get involved in a particular business. He did. It was a sale. He did anyway. She put a curse on him, and he died. There's a man named Sam Schumann. Sam Schumann had diabetes, and he had esophageal cancer. And his scans suggested that he had metastases to his liver, and he was going to die. But he didn't want to die, particularly didn't want to die without seeing his family over the holidays. So what happened was that his doctor encouraged him to stick with it. He made it through the holidays, and as soon as the holidays were over, he died. At post-mortem, there was almost nothing wrong with him. Now, the hyperactivity one in Australia, most were men. They died of fear from sorcery. Their eyeballs would protrude, their pupils would dilate, and many of them would go into kidney failure. There's something called boning, and the idea is that you're given a hex and someone points a bone at you. That's really a bad thing. These Aboriginal tribesmen in Australia, upon seeing an enemy pointing the bone at them, convulsed and died. So I'm going to read this. This is boning, described in 1925 by Dr. Herman Baisdow about Australian Aborigines. The man who discovers that he's being boned is indeed a pitiable sight. He stands aghast with his eyes staring at the treacherous pointer and with his hands lifted as though to ward off the lethal medium which he images is pouring into his body. His cheeks blanch, his eyes become glassy, and the expression of his face becomes horribly distorted. He attempts to shriek, but usually the sound chokes in his throat, and all that might see is a froth in his mouth. His body begins to tremble, and his muscles twist involuntarily. He sways backward and falls to the ground, and after a short time appears to be in a swoon, and soon after he begins, as if in mortal agony, covering his face with his hands, begin to moan, and his death is only a matter of comparatively short time. This is a routine situation in this part of the world after you've been boned. Turns out this is a report, this is actually just not long ago, in Sussex, England. There was a whole group of sheep. A wolf came over, excuse me, growled at them, and 100 of them dropped dead. Now we have something in medicine which is called Brugada syndrome, which is a genetic problem where if you're given a fright, an electrical problem in the heart occurs, your muscles don't contract, and you suddenly die. This is genetic, we know well. This is well described in people. Now 4 is unlucky in Chinese and Japanese people because it's similar to the word for death. Excuse me. In a study studying people in 1973 to 98 who died at the first of every month, it was 7% higher than white Americans, 13% higher for people with chronic heart disease, and 27% of these Asians living in California died on the 4th. The first 5 presidents of the United States died July 4th. How patriotic, you know. The Maori Aborigines of New Zealand. Now there's a case of a 18-year-old male whose hex was that he shouldn't eat wild game. Okay, that was his hex. And what happened was, while he was traveling, he stayed at a friend's home and had breakfast. When he asked his friend whether the food had wild game, he was assured that it didn't happen. He ate the food and left. About 2 years later, he visited the friend again, and the friend said, "Have you ever eaten wild game?" And of course his reply was no. His then friend, "Ha, I tricked you 2 years ago. I gave you wild game," and within a day the man died. This is called a pufferfish, and you may have heard a little about this. James Cook, in his trip many years ago, the crew ate pufferfish. It was a local fish, and they were catching them. And what happens is the crew ate the pufferfish, and then the remnants were kind of fed to the pigs. There were a few hundred pigs on board as well. That night, most of the crew became ill, not terribly ill, but ill, and all the pigs died. And we began to learn that pufferfish has a toxin called detrodotoxin. And you may know in Japan, people do eat pufferfish sushi. And it turns out that if you're a sushi chef and you want to make this stuff, you have to pass a very extensive course on how to cut out the organ. Most of it's around the ovary of the pufferfish. And then they have to take an exam, and the pass rate of the exam is very, very low. With all these precautions, over 100 people every year die in Japan from detrodotoxin from pufferfish, usually pufferfish sushi. So the question has been, maybe the zombie powder, this has been the theory, the idea of zombies has to do with detrodotoxin. And there's a report that Wade Davis spoke about many years ago of someone who died, at least they thought he died, turns out of detrodotoxin, and he was buried, and they had a funeral, and then the next day they saw him kind of walking around the town. And it's believed that this is traceable to this stuff called detrodotoxin or fugu poisoning. So we want to legalize detrodotoxin. There's a tremendous concern about that. So I wanted to convince you that there's a lot more to placebo than faking people out, and there's a lot more to nocebo than faking people out. So thank you very much.
Go to nerdnite.com to find a Nerd Night event near you. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for our latest presentation.